prions work? If I can kind of, I mean, you know, are there genetic factors? Is there anything we can do to treat this disease? Unfortunately, there's currently no treatment, no cure for these diseases. To kind of get a sense of where this disease comes from biologically, you know, these prion diseases have been found to be both infectious, genetic as well. They seem to run in certain families, and maybe even occur spontaneously. This kind of triple etiologies, which no wonder Prusner got the Nobel Prize for his theory. And his theory is that all of us, it seems, have prion proteins throughout our bodies. Every single one of us here in this room have prion proteins in their neuronal membranes, kind of studying the membranes that wrap all the nerves in our body. And since most of the nerves are in our brain, that's where most of the prions are. In fact, we have found prion proteins in every species we've ever looked at, from fruit flies all the way on up. And in fact, these proteins are highly conserved by evolution. So the fruit fly prion protein looks a lot like our prion protein, which makes one think, boy, this must be some really important protein. We have no idea what it does, and so when scientists have no idea what a protein does, what they do is they genetically engineer a transgenic, what they call knockout mouse, where they basically make a mouse that doesn't express the gene. See what happens. And the mouse is born and looks perfectly fine. Later in life starts walking backwards, gets insomnia, and dies. We still have no idea what the heck the protein does, but the scientists like to do those kind of things. And the theory is that perhaps one of those prion proteins somewhere in your body undergoes, in 1 in a million people, perhaps, undergoes what's called a post-translational conformational change. Basically, it's already made, it just changes its shape. Same amino acid sequence, but it just changes its shape from what's called a predominantly alpha helical structure, kind of like a spiral, to what's called a predominantly beta-pleated sheet structure, which is kind of like a Ruffles potato chip. Right? So it goes from kind of a spiral to a potato chip. And the only difference between that new shape and the old shape is that the body doesn't know what to do with this new shape. It can't break it down. Normally, every day we make proteins, we degrade proteins. We make proteins, but the body doesn't know how to break this one protein down. Okay, who cares? You got one protein somewhere in your body that the body can't break down. What's the big deal? Aha! Well, here's the funky part, which will be familiar to any sci-fi Ice 9 fans. There's a novel written. Is that once one of these abnormally shaped prion proteins comes in contact with a normally shaped one, they both go off in that evil potato chip form. Right? And then we have exponential growth. 2 becomes 4 becomes 8, and it starts this deadly cascade. And these prion proteins build up in your nerve cells, and the nerve cells die, leaving holes where your nerves used to be, hence this sponge-like texture of their brain, and then you die. And that's where it ends unless, for example, you are a member of the Papua New Guinea Foray tribe, which ate the brains of their dead. And then, if you ate one of their brains filled with abnormally shaped prion proteins, that abnormal protein goes down into your intestine, and based on research on sheep, seems to come through your intestine into your spleen, climb up the splenic nerve to your spinal cord, and slowly creep up your spinal cord into your brain, and then you have this abnormally shaped prion protein in your brain to trigger the deadly cascade all over again, and then you die too. The same thing if you're a burger eating Brit, because those abnormally shaped cow proteins are enough to trigger ours as well. And so, unfortunately, because it's your body's own protein, even though it's shaped a little different, your immune system doesn't see it all. That's why there's no hope of vaccination or anything, because it completely goes under the immune system's radar. And so, you know, this is a new pathogen. I mean, to even start thinking about therapeutics is, I think, a little optimistic, but certainly money should be pouring into that area, since there may be many more deaths on our hands in the future. The question was, what about the slaughter process? Are there different types of slaughter processes, for example, that make the meat particularly risky? And I think that's an excellent point. And it's because the meat industry would have us believe that the meat itself is not infectious. Yes, you don't want to eat the brain or the spinal cord, but who does that? We like eating steak, right? The problem is there's evidence now that even the muscle itself may indeed be infectious. In fact, there was just a study reported in the New England Journal of Medicine where they did these autopsy studies of human Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease victims and found many of their muscle biopsies actually had these prions in them. And so the muscle itself may be infectious, but less infectious certainly than the brain or spinal cord. So that's what we're particularly concerned about. And of course, that's the brain and spinal cord is what makes beef flavoring and beef broth and these so-called natural flavors here in the U.S. and go into, you know, cosmetics and pet food and animal feed and all sorts of other things, and can be included from younger cattle in hot dogs and these fast food toppings, etc. But even if you stick to steak, the problem is not only is there a risk from the muscle meat itself, is that there's a concern about central nervous system contamination of the meat, either at slaughter or right after slaughter. So what they do basically, you know, we've known in the human trauma literature for decades that people who undergo head trauma, like in a car accident or something, end up with what are called brain emboli. Pieces of brain in parts of their body just kind of gets knocked into their circulatory system. And so, the predominant method by which we stun animals unconscious for slaughter here in the U.S. is this captive bolt stunning, where we basically use a kind of explosive charge to kind of cave in the animal's brain, and that is hopefully enough to make the cow unconscious before she's bled to death. And unfortunately, you know, and so researchers say, "Whoa, wait a second. We better make sure that we aren't ending up with brain throughout the bodies of these animals." And indeed, researchers at Texas A&M indeed found one poor cow had a 14-centimeter piece of brain tissue in her lung, and it was clear to them that these methods of stunning to the head, you know, circulate brain matter throughout the bodies of animals stunned for slaughter. So that's a real concern. And so, you know, that pink juice in your, you know, steak, I mean, you know, cows don't have juice, you know, that's blood, and that may indeed contain central nervous system tissue. And the second concern is when you split the carcass. So then you have, after the animal's bled to death, you basically split the carcass with kind of a band saw or circular saw right down the spinal column. And basically you aerosolize the spinal cord all over the meat. I mean, you basically just spray it all over the meat, and which basically infects all the various cuts of meat. So that's another concern about central nervous system contamination of the meat. So even, we know muscle meat may be infectious. Is it infectious enough to infect humans? We don't know, but we know that the brain is infectious enough, and unfortunately the brain and spinal cord can contaminate the meat tissue as well, unfortunately, either at slaughter or right afterwards in the packing process.